Here's a
It's
different
transitive, right?
articulation, okay? Look, it's very simple. Principle of causal transitivity. If A depends on B, this is depends for the entirety of its existence. If A depends on B, and if B depends on C, it therefore follows purely logically that A depends on C. That's the principle of transitivity in causal dependency relations. I don't know anyone who rejects this.
Yes,
Okay.
it's impossible to reject it.
Yeah, it's
There's
just
plenty
like
of people who
it's a
reject it.
total logical entailment. It's non controversial. Anyway.
It actually is pretty controversial.
So I'm
What?
sorry. No, it's not.
No, it's not.
Yeah, it is.
It's not controversial at all.
It's controversial in like modern analytic philosophy, at least.
No, it's not. Go
I could
read.
just
Go
point,
go read.
just to point
Go
you to a
read
whole bunch
Jonathan.
of literature.
Yeah, I can point you to literature too.
Yeah, but I can point you to the literature that just is the controversy, right? It's like a you can't say
I
it's
can
not
point you
controversial.
to
It
the
just is.
literature that clearly says that this is not controversial at all.
But then they have to
Transitivity.
then have to like deal with the actual controversy that's going on.
Okay, no, no. Give me the argument though. If so, again, let me restate the principle. If A depends on B, okay, and if B depends on C, it follows that A depends on C. Now,
Yeah,
give me
my
an
point is
argument
that
against that.
I'm not here to give an argument against it. I just wanted to comment
Okay, then
briefly.
you don't have an argument against it. So give me
I
a
never said that I
reason to
did. I never
reject it.
said that I did. All I said was that whether causation is transitive or dependence relations are transitive is a controversial issue in modern analytic philosophy. That's all I was saying.
No, it's not
Wait,
so
one sec, one
if
sec.
it's a
Okay.
controversial
Well,
issue,
let's
there's an
just grant
argument
it.
against what I said. So
Wait, no,
give me
Khalil.
the argument.
It's very simple. So friction. If you're the one that's
Oh,
since you're an expert, or since you've done your readings and you've done your research, and you've seen both sides of the coin, then you should at least have one argument or one piece of information to bring on the other side of how A is not dependent on C. Do you have anything? Because if
yeah.
you
So
don't, it just seems like you're
I
just at your
can
ass.
give you an argument for thinking
Okay,
that causal
Go ahead.
dependencies are not transitive. It's a bit
Go ahead.
complicated if you.
No, just friction.
It's a,
Explain to us why A does not depend on C. Can you do that?
In the case
yeah, it's a
scenario,
bit.
by the way, just so we have audience
That
context.
way, that way, we know you're not actually regurgitating random
Yeah,
information. You actually know what you're talking about.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
go.
there's a bunch of different things I could say here. One of them, which is I'm somewhat partial to, it's a bit complicated because it relies on this contrastivist notion of causal relations. So,
Send the
I mean,
article.
probably
Send the
to explain.
article, man. Send the article.
Yeah. So
Just
I know
send me the
Schaffer has some
article.
articles on that.
Yeah. If you think it's complicated, just
Yeah,
send me
sure.
the article.
Sorry, who did you just name?
I named Schaffer, for example. He has a. No,
So are you
Schaffer.
saying,
Sorry.
bro,
Well,
are you saying that Schaffer
well,
thinks this is controversial because he writes the exact opposite of that?
no, he doesn't. But also Schaffer, and the name I was thinking of was Synod Armstrong. That's the other guy I was thinking of because he has a view that causation is
Friction, maybe you
is
didn't hear
contrastivist.
Khalil or you didn't understand what he was saying. He was literally
Yeah,
just saying if A depends on B and B depends on C, then A depends on C.
yeah.
That's all he said. Like, does that make sense?
I heard it right. The implication there is that the dependence or causal relation in question is transitive, and that's controversial. And
But we are
the view
talking
that sort of
specifically
The
argument
about
there is
causal dependence.
dependency relation is
yeah,
transitive.
yeah. And notice that I said
Not the
both.
so it the dependency relation, the fact that
Yeah,
A depends on B and B depends on C entails A
yeah,
depends on C. That is transitive
right.
and that's non-controversial.
Yeah, that's what I was pointing out. Which either one we're talking about is going to be controversial. Yeah.
Okay, can you cite the literature? Can you give the argument against the principle?
Well, I started giving one. I mean, if you want me to just say some literature, I could.
Yeah. Please go
Okay,
on
no,
and
you
send it to
Friction,
me.
mentioned
go ahead.
Schaeffer. You mentioned Schaffer, Jonathan Schaffer. Are
Yeah,
you claiming that Jonathan Schaffer disputes this principle of transitivity?
yeah. I mean, he said to me in person that grounding, for example, is non-transitive. Yeah.
Okay, can you repeat that?
Jonathan Schaffer said in print and like directly to me. I had a
Yeah,
conversation
say
with
it to
him
me. Yeah.
that grounding
Yes.
relations are non-transitive. Yeah. That's the
Okay,
sort of
you've
conversation.
misunderstood what he said.
Are you
No,
quoting
I didn't. I've read it several times in
Yeah,
print
no, you have
and
no
directly
idea.
from him.
Okay, this is Jonathan Schaffer, and I quote, "It is
Jonathan Sheffer.
natural to assume that." Yeah, that's what I said,
Yes,
right?
Khalil is Jonathan Schaffer now.
He's
No,
reading,
no,
bro.
Okay,
Come
no,
on,
no.
man.
Khalil, no, no. Khalil is gonna literally read you a quote by the same
I'm
individual.
quoting Jonathan
Yeah,
Schaffer.
like he's literally reading
This
it.
is his well-known article, right?
Yeah.
It's called
Well known.
"Grounding,
Shit.
Transitivity, and Contra." It's called "Grounding, Transitivity, and Contrastivity." Jonathan Schaffer. This is chapter 4 in an edited
Yeah,
volume.
I've
You
read
can
it several
find
times.
this on his website, right?
It's
Okay.
chapter
So
4
section
on his
Yeah, yeah, Alfred,
4.1,
Alfred. Come on, man. He's providing reference.
chapter
Is that fair?
4.1. Can I finish? Okay. Jonathan Schaffer. If you just, I want everyone to hear this, that our friend here has cited Jonathan Schaffer to argue
Yep.
against the transitivity of
Correct.
grounding.
He denies it.
And
Yeah.
you're saying he denies it. Okay.
100%.
I
Yes.
hope, like, he denies it.
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct. He denies it in this book and also in other print and in the conversation as well.
Okay. Quote, "It is natural to assume that grounding is transitive. It is natural to assume the
Correct.
validity of the following inference schema. The fact that A grounds the fact of B, the fact that B grounds the fact that there is C, therefore, thus, the fact that A grounds the fact that there is C." He literally like types this out. Then he says, "Indeed, the assumption of transitivity is so natural that it is widely incorporated into accounts of grounding without any further discussion. For instance," and he cites himself, "Schaffer, 2009b, page 376, boldly asserts that grounding is transitive."
Oof.
So he just said the opposite of what you said.
Wait, you have to keep reading, right? let me pull it
He
up because
never, bro, the whole
later
section.
on he says
No,
no.
the entire
Okay,
section is for transitivity. He also
no, it
says
isn't.
later on the page, the assumption of transitivity is also formally useful.
Yeah, his ultimate
And then
conclusion
he
is that it's
goes through,
false. Let me bring it up. I take it that it's irreflexive, antisymmetric, transitive. There's also other things you can say about how it's. I mean, you might think there's some room for doubt on those things, but I think this is kind of standard view.
I'd probably be orthodox. I actually don't myself accept that, but I don't accept transitivity without some careful fixes. But I mean, that is the orthodox view. Yeah. So I'm happy to just sort of take that up for discussion as the orthodox view.
Wait, didn't Detroyer interview him?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can also point you to the point in the conversation where he actually corrects me and says that he rejects it. But that's. I mean, let me just find it in this as well because I've read this before.
Yeah, I'd like to add at least, okay, maybe there was a case scenario where you talk to him and it's just like, I don't know, maybe not available in like academia or something like that, right? Where Khalil didn't see it, but it's totally fair to assume that Khalil.
Well, I don't see what turns on this.
To be honest, it's a sub conversation anyway. We could, Mr. House, did you read Ilyas's conversation or argument?
Whose?
Ilyas, the reason we left off that conversation
Yeah. So
was.
let me just say quickly. Note that in section 4.3, 4.2 is where he offers counterexamples to the transitivity grounding. And section 4.3 says, "I've offered counterexamples to the transitivity grounding. See section 4.2." But it would be unsatisfying to leave it as a matter of fact. He goes on to, I believe he has. Don't quote me on this, but this is what he said to me, and I think he says this in here, is that there's a sort of qualified version. If we fix certain contrast classes or something, then there's a sort of transitivity that we can recover. But grounding relations, like on their own, are not transitive. And this whole section is an argument for that, right? If you look, 4.1 is he talks about this is kind of the common view. It is transitive. And here's some of the reasons why people have held the common view, quote unquote. And then 4.2 is where he starts introducing counterexamples. He talks about there's the cat's meow example.
Oh, his
There's a third
all his
member
counter
example.
examples,
There's
all his
the
counter
dented sphere
examples,
example.
all his
And
counter examples are based on notional properties. They do
you
not.
could think that his
No,
counterexamples are wrong. I'm just
Listen to
saying
me.
what his
Listen.
view
No,
is.
no. Listen to me. Listen to me. All the counter examples that he cites, I am not going to take this man up. Who took this man up? Kick him out. This person is not coming up. Yes, I am going to talk with you, Friction. All the counter examples that he offers are based on notional properties, right? When we are talking about ontological propositions, we clearly exclude notional properties, right? For example, let me read out here. The fact that a thing has a dent grounds the fact that a thing has a shape, right? The shape is a notional property, right? In the description of ontological propositions, there's nothing like a shape, right? The only propositions that explain the reality are the propositions that ontologically explain the coordinates of the material object or whatever the object that may be. So this proposition is merely i'tibari. In Islamic philosophy, we call it i'tibari. It's merely notional, it's merely nominal. It's not a proposition about ontology of something. And that is exactly how modern analytical philosophy confuses people.
I didn't
Right?
know
So
that.
when we are talking about ontological propositions, we are very clear in excluding such kind of propositions that can have circular dependent relationships. We are not talking about a notional or nominal proposition.
That's great. That has zero to do with what I was talking about. So,
It's
just to be clear,
my bad. If I
just
can hold that thought, brother. My apologies.
okay.
It's very crucial to the convo at hand and what really Dr. Khalil is meaning by that. You know what I mean? My bad to cut you off, but keep going.
Yeah, I just want to make something very clear, right? All I was commenting on was what Schaffer's view is that he defended here and elsewhere, which is that the transitive regrounding is false. And that's just, I just made that very clear.
That's
It's
not
clear. He just
ontological grounding
blatantly
that we are
denies it.
talking.
But
You
Yeah,
might point,
this is
it might be
not.
this is not
fair.
the
It might be fair to
ontological
say, it
this is
might be
not the
fair to say that
ontological grounding.
this is not entirely relevant to the
Yeah,
argument that
exactly.
you're
It is
making. I
not
don't
relevant to
care,
what we are
right? All I
talking
was
about.
saying that I was correct about
No,
what Schaffer
what Dr.
defends.
Khalil, what Dr. You just made a red herring here. What Dr. Khalil was talking about was ontological grounding, right? What you are talking about here
I don't know what
is merely
ontological grounding
propositional.
is.
Ontological grounding, I already gave you an example. I already sent how's the article. Ontological grounding in our worldview, I can read it out for you. It is not like how Schaffer is defining
Just say
metaphysical grounding
dependus.
here.
Then you're fine. Then you're talking about something other than what Schaffer was talking about. I don't care. All I was
Yeah,
saying that
Yeah,
this
so
is this view
I
that Schaffer
mentioned
defends.
yeah,
dependent.
yeah,
Okay, let's get back to
exactly,
this. So
exactly.
here's the thing.
So you just did a
Schaffer.
red herring, nothing else.
It's not a
Okay,
red
so
herring.
here's the
What?
thing. Right.
It is a red
No,
herring.
because Schaffer wasn't. Okay, here's the thing. I phrased this when I set the when I made the premise. I phrased it. I didn't. The way I phrased it was very clear. If A depends on B and B depends on C, and A depends on C. That's what I said. Okay, so the dependence relation is transitive. That's the claim I'm making. Now,
Right.
what Schaffer is talking about when he actually first he talks about first all the reasons why people have assumed that grounding. Now, grounding is a little bit different than dependence. Okay,
Exactly.
grounding relation is a much more specific, restricted kind of dependence because it's
Correct.
phrased not like look how I phrased. I said A depends on B, B depends on C, but grounding relations are phrased differently, right? They're phrased as A grounds B, B grounds C. Now, the reason why Schaffer, and he's specifically talking about grounding, dependence is much broader than grounding, but he's specifically talking about grounding because Schaffer's purpose to give counterexamples to transitivity of grounding, not dependence, but of grounding, is because Schaffer wants to say that a grounding relation must be contrastive, which is to
Yeah.
say that when we say A grounds B, which is A grounds B is a much stronger statement than B depends on A, because A grounds B, right? He wants to say that this has to be a contrastively, this has to be contrastive. That is to say, uh, A has to be the underlying necessary sufficient condition for B obtaining, right? As opposed to anything that's not B, right? So he wants that contrastive grounding. And I frankly think he's right on that. Like I agree with him on that. And I would use Schaffer's argument about contrastive grounding to attack, libertarian free will or something like that. Right? That's how you could use it. Right? So
Yeah.
why did the agent pick chocolate over vanilla? The libertarian will say that the reasons the agent has for picking chocolate didn't necessitate the choice of chocolate, right? So the libertarian explanation is not contrastive. Schaffer's grounding would come and say, no, it has to be contrastive. So that's what Schaffer was up to in that particular paper. But my claim, right, was about dependence, not grounding. Dependence is much broader. So if A depends on B and B depends on C, then A depends on C. That's the original claim.
Yeah.
And that claim has not been attacked by Schaffer or anybody as far as I know.
Yeah. It has. So let me just make two. I got to go in a couple minutes. I just want to make two quick points. First, I just want to make it clear that you very clearly stated that I was wrong about what Schaffer defended, and I was vindicated on that. But leave that aside.
Yeah,
Um,
no. You were wrong because you
no,
misunderstood Doctor. What? No, you misunderstood what Doctor
no,
Andani
no.
was
He
saying.
very clearly
You
stated
thought
that Schaffer
no.
denies. No,
You thought that Doctor Andani was talking about grounding. He was not talking about grounding.
no,
He
I didn't
said
say
that
that.
Shaffer.
I never
No.
said
You
that.
did say that.
You're just
He
incorrect.
said
He
no.
said that
He
this
said
replays are on,
yes.
so we don't need to
Yes.
bicker over. He clearly said that Schaffer
Shaffer does
accepts the
say
transitivity of grounding, and he started listing from section 4.1 in support of that. I just pointed out that I was incorrect. Now we can set that aside because I just want to make a broader point, which is that this conclusion can be used to draw broader conclusions about dependence relations in general. One is you can the fact that this is a specific sort of dependence relation um, still points to the fact that, well, not all dependence relations are transitive. So you can have a sort of dependence relation which is non-transitive, and um, and in fact, I think Schaffer would perhaps endorse this, or at least certain other people would. For example, I mentioned Walter and Armstrong, which is that dependence relations more broadly are also going to be contrastive and so non-transitive in that way as well. I would actually endorse something like that, and so there would be an argument against dependence relations broadly rather than just dependence relations qua grounding. But that's a further argument. But the main point I wanted to make was that Schaffer was denying the transitive grounding relations, and that I wasn't misunderstanding Khalil. Anyone can go back and listen to the recording. He was very clearly stating incorrectly that Schaffer accepts the transitive grounding. All right, I'll let you for the last word.
So again, right, I didn't misquote Schaffer because he has cited himself about the transitivity of grounding. But the reason why he gave counterexamples in that particular article to it, as you rightly pointed out, was not because he was disputing the transitivity of dependence, but because he wants to give a counterfactual account of grounding. That's why. So nothing like you brought up Schaffer. I didn't bring him up, and you tried to say, "Oh, the transitivity of dependence relations is disputed," and you brought up Schaffer as the example of that. But that he
Yeah.
doesn't actually attack transitivity of dependence.
Yeah.
Well,
Anyway, guys,
well, actually,
can we get back to
so
the convo?
well, so on the first thing, yes, in some of Schaffer's earlier work, he has assumed, along with most people working in that area, that grounding is transitive. And if you're just saying that in his early work he defended something like that, then sure. But it's not something he now defends. And the work that you pointed to is something in which he rejects it. So you're still wrong to quote him as supporting transitive grounding, especially by pointing to something which he very clearly argues against it. But
Okay,
on
as
the
I
other point,
said, it's dependence. Does Schaffer attack the transitivity of dependence?
well, it's a depend. So again, two things. This is another question. So if you're granting already that I was correct, that he does deny the transitive grounding, which you denied, it is he is attacking also, since grounding relations are sort of dependence relation, that all dependence relations are transitive. You might want to point out, as I already mentioned briefly, that okay, maybe grounding relations, although a sort of dependence relation, aren't transitive. Maybe there's some more general notion of a dependence relation that's not specifically a grounding relation that is transitive. And I think the same sort of reasoning can be applied in an argument against the transitivity of that sort of relation. But strictly speaking, Schaffer's argument doesn't itself get you there. That's something that you'd have to supplant as well on top of that. But
So
and I
can
would
you
supplant that.
attack the
I think the
dependence
dependence.
relation? No. So can you
Yeah, I did.
attack the?
Yeah,
No, you haven't. You haven't given us an argument.
no, I
So
did. Right. I
give
think
us
the
an.
argument's going to be the argument's going to be the same. A dependence relation more generally is
But
going to be contrastive. And so the exact same reasoning that goes in favor of grounding relations being non-transitive is going to apply here. The fact that it's contrastive, because you can
so
have
give us the argument.
yeah. So the basic argument is when you have a depending on b, well, that's going to be true, contrast dependent fact, and you can have a, it could be true relative to a particular contrast class, and b depending on c could be true with respect to a different contrast class, and a depending on c with respect to a certain contrast class could be false, right? Because the contrast classes can vary. This is the whole point that Schaffer makes in his argument against the transitive grounding relations. If dependence relations more generally are contrastive, then the same precise argument is going to apply there as well. So people employ this, like, for example, as Walter Sidney Armstrong has done against in the causation case. He kind of goes, I think, a little bit overboard. He thinks that pretty much everything is contrastive, but that's the sort of argument that would be made, or that could be made, and there are perhaps others that could be
By
made.
the way, my bad. Hold that thought for a second. I just want to get your position clear. You know what I mean? Because clarity equals goodness. Yes.
Sure.
Okay. So, if a case scenario A depends on B, B depends on C, and there's no other things that exist in this case scenario, right? Would you say A depends on C? Just like out of your reading of philosophy, the conclusion you've come up to. Maybe you want to take an agnostic stance. Maybe you want to read more, or maybe you've read so much to the point where you're like, humans don't have an answer to this, right? I'm saying, like, what's your opinion on this?
I think the case is underspecified. So, saying that A depends on B, well, if dependence relations are going to be contrastive, then you haven't told me what the contrast class is. Then I don't really know.
Well, in this
whether
possible world, there's only three things. There's just three things. There's A, B, and C. That's all there is. So let me specify that. Because the whole purpose of this discussion, right, is to talk about a very specific situation, right? So we're not talking about A in one possible world, B in another possible world, B, C in another. We're talking about A, B, and C. That's it.
Nothing changes regardless if there's like no other entities apart from those. I mean, leaving aside that, you're making this kind of, someone's making this interesting point against dog, which is that you can't really have two objects because then you'll have this collection of them, or maybe they're composite.
By the way, it's just because it's not like I was appealing to the reality there. It's just Mr. House in that case scenario was appealing to the reality of the combination. You get what I mean? In order to ground those two things. You got what I mean? It wasn't like I was making some overarching claim sets or XYZ. No. It's just he was appealing to the fact that they interdepend upon one another in A and B, and he said it wasn't a contradiction if there's only two existing things. Right? However, I think you can accept that the set AB is different than A and individually B, right?
Well,
it's just different. It's a different real thing. I'm assuming you accept that.
I accept that I was accepted there's a composite of them. That they form
that's what I'm talking
object.
about. Yeah, a composite. Yeah. I'm just saying the composite is different than each individual. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. I mean, someone could reject that they form a composite. I think that's kind of a weird view, but
maybe they do. By the way, maybe they do. I just say if they do, then Mr. House can't appeal to the fact that they actually depend upon one another. You get what I mean? I'm saying I'm using his premise in his situation. You get what I mean?
If you have such a view of sets, then any object will result in an infinite number of objects.
Yeah, but we're talking
about
circular dependence.
Because I wasn't talking about sets. There would always be existing objects.
Yeah.
Wait, hand. But I wasn't talking about sets.
I was talking about a finite set,
talking about composites.
Infinite number of objects, right? Anyway, go back to yourself.
I think instead of sets, they really want to be saying something in terms of like composites, right? So like if you had, it's like saying that, like, I can imagine a world in which there's only two, rocks, right? Well, okay, but there's also the thing that we can talk about as
The
the thing
Earth,
composed of
yeah,
both of those rocks, right?
and the Earth under them, yes. Yeah.
Well, suppose there's no Earth, right?
Okay.
I mean, even supposing that these rocks weren't already composite objects, there's
Well,
also the composition of those two rocks.
but it's also
I
like,
guess the
we're
point
talking
that
about rocks now, right? Like rocks are composite. It's like a rock that isn't composite is kind of weird.
yeah.
But
But
I'm saying
suppose I don't
specifically
know.
this,
Suppose there's
right?
something that's not composite, like some fundamental particle or something.
Yeah. Even in that case scenario, right? If one,
The two
it's
particles
essentially
could
what's happening. By
compose
the way, I'm
an
not sure if
object.
this is too controversial. By the way, I'm not even sure if you disagree with me. So just to see clarity, I'll give
I
you
don't
like
think
an
I do.
example. Yeah, I don't think you do. Right. So look, I'm saying his case scenario is like this. Here, you have one object, you have another object. Hey, can they exist dependently upon one another? Yes, because there's A, B. There's the combo of objects. Look at it. It's an appeal to reality of those objects. You got what I mean? I'm not sure if you disagree with that, but and
Wait,
I'm assuming you think
I
that
don't.
the set is different than what composes the set.
Hang on. Are you saying Are you saying that he was saying that
I was
they could
arguing.
depend on each other because they're
Yeah. So I was
together?
arguing he was. I was arguing he was appealing to their reality. And right now, you were just
Yeah.
saying, right, that the conversation hinted to stuff like these. But I just wanted to clarify in that point. It's not me just randomly like being like, hey, there's a random set there, and there's also another set with a totality and a random member, like how the sun is related to the ocean in some weird way. No, I'm just saying in this case scenario where we have two ladders leaning upon one another, then you have a real leaning happening. That's kind of what I'm saying. But anyway, we could go back to what you were saying if you want to finish your statement. My apologies for cutting you off.
Oh, no, it's all good. I was just. It sounded like you were saying that that Dog was saying something like, these two things depend on each other. What? Because
Oh yeah.
there's a third thing there, the object that they compose or something.
Oh, so this is what I was saying, right? So I said let's stick to like A and B, and because we're talking about circular dependency right now, we're not talking about an infinite set.
Yeah.
Because back in the day, right, it was kind of an agreement with me and Mr. Dog that like circular dependency is a contradiction, right? If there's just circular dependency, not some weird possible world situation, right? If you just have two things, right, and they depend on each other, from our both understanding, me, Zain, Ilyas, Khalil, have spent several hours on this talking. So this is kind of like, we've already been through this, so maybe we skip some steps, right? However, right there, right, he was appealing to two things, right? And I was making the argument that in order to have these things, and actually he agreed with me on this part, if these things were not connected at all, right, and they were completely not connected, however, there were two things that exist and they were dependent, and there were only two things that exist. He agreed that that was a contradiction. So then there's a difference in the world, call it, where they depend upon one another, right? So we have a different existence. We have a different possible world. You got what I mean? So, and I think you agree. Sounds like you agree with this, or at least relatively agree, practically agree with this.
I think
Maybe
I'm
there's some
agreeing so
weird
far.
philosophy. Yeah. So I was saying the contradiction would be something like this. Because he's saying there's only two things that depend on each other, right? The contradiction is that in his case scenario, there's three things, right? 2 doesn't equal 3, contradiction. You got what I mean?
Well, I mean, the contradiction there is not derived from the fact of the dependence. The contradiction is derived from the fact that you're saying that there's only two things.
Yeah, but it's still a
When, in fact,
contradiction that it entails. In his view, that there can
yeah.
only be two
Sorry,
things.
just one other thing. Sorry. Look, just regarding Schaffer and the grounding part, right? So, as you well know, in that article, he doesn't end by denying transitivity. He just says we have differential transitivity. And the example that he gives of differential transitivity, basically you still have transitivity. You actually have transitivity of the dependent relations and the grounding relations. And then he goes through all the counterexamples based on differential transitivity and resolves all of them.
Yes. In fact, I already said this. In fact, if you go back, listen back, I
Yes,
initially said
but this is the
he
thing,
recovers a
right? Like
restricted form of transitivity.
basically he never actually denies transitivity. He just
Certainly
specifies it
does.
more. That's it. Yeah.
No,
What do you mean he certainly
I
does?
don't know. Friction, at least
He
at face value,
read.
maybe you
This
were
is
still with
ridiculous. I
awareness.
mean, read his like his description of differential transitivity, right?
Yeah.
And his description of differential transitivity of causation. None of his conclusions that in this paper attack anything that I said.
Yeah,
None of
this would
it.
just take 30 seconds. There's just like 30 seconds to explain. Yeah, so he, if you look at his definition of differential transitivity and the sort of transitivity that he accepts in the end, and he uses that, as you say, to explain the cases that he brings up. What those effectively do is fix the contrast classes in each of the stages of grounding, and that preserves the transitive structure. Now, and that's true, right? That's that, on his view, that's a sort of transitivity you can have, but that's not something you get just saying, or A grounds B, or A depends on B in relevant sense, and B depends on C, or B grounds C, then A grounds C. You can't employ his restricted account of transitivity to say that that's transitive. No, you can only you have to add in these additional details to get the transitivity. So if you just say A depends on B and B depends on C, then A depends on C, or grounding, whatever he's talking about, you can't. You'll reject that, right? That's false on his view, strictly speaking. There are certain cases where it is true, right? In particular with particular examples, and you can have a sort of principle to determine which of those examples will satisfy that by looking at which satisfy the additional criteria of his differential transitivity. But strictly speaking, he denies, and he said this here as elsewhere, that the transitivity the grounding is not a transitive relation on its own.
I mean, in his
But anyways,
conclusion, he literally says either way differential transitivity stands. So now
yeah,
how
I
does
agree. I
differential
agree.
transitivity right. So he holds to differential transitivity, right? Now how does anything I say like violate that?
Yeah, straightforwardly, the
Or
differential transitivity is not transitivity. It's not the transitivity of grounding. It's a transitivity
it,
of these particular relations,
no,
which are not straightforward grounding
it,
relations.
it is a transitivity of grounding. It's just differential. It
Yeah,
just means that it's basically the different. What he stated for us here is what used to be known by medievals as the difference principle. So if there's a difference in the effect, then there's a difference in the cause. And if there's a difference in the
no,
cause, there's a difference in the effect.
that's completely unrelated. Yeah, so
That's
the
literally that's what it is, though.
no, no. That's entirely unrelated. That's ridiculous. You would say that the differential transitivity is all this. All that's doing is fixing the um, the contrast in the relation. So, um, I would have to just like
It's basically
read it
saying
out at this point.
like like the fact that like A rather than A plus grounds B rather than B plus, and the fact that B grounds C rather than B plus grounding C plus. But all that's saying is that if you have a change in the effect, then there will be a change in the cause, and if there's a change in the cause, there'll be a change in the effect.
No,
Yeah,
that's
by the
just
way, just
completely
to note
wrong.
that because we're
Yeah,
talking about like existential dependency, this especially applies. Just to note that.
And like on page 136, right? He demonstrates and he writes out the transitive grounding relation, which, by the way, I don't even need that much for a dependency relation. But even still, he affirms that.
yeah. So I don't. There's
So
probably
can
not much
maybe
to
you
read
can
in it,
help
but
me out here in my
what you said
thing
about the
of
difference principle is just completely irrelevant to this. It's not. It's not what he's saying at
that
all.
is the difference principle.
No, no, it isn't. So,
Yes, it
it,
is. Yes, it
so
is.
the principle.
It is
No, no,
the
no. So
difference
I can explain
principle.
it. I can explain the difference if you want. So what you cited was um, some sort of um, difference. What was he said? Difference in an effect requires like a corresponding difference in the cause. That's I know who was it
So
that was
you
it
have some
Diablo
effect.
or
The idea is like you have some effect, okay? You have some effect, okay? The effect depends on its cause or its ground, whatever you want to call it, right? So the whole idea here is that if I'm trying to explain the effect A, and I say A depends on B, then the ground of A, which is B, has to explain why this is A as opposed to anything else.
Well, as opposed to something fixed by the contrast class. So it might not be anything
As
else, but
opposed to
something else.
anything different from A, basically. The explanation or the ground has to account for the fact that you have A as opposed to anything different from A. So
No.
if the
So
ground that I posit for A, right, would also serve as a ground or explanation for A plus plus, A squared, whatever, then I have not given a contrastive treatment of grounding.
so actually two problems there. One, nothing in this notion of grounding requires that the same thing can't ground multiple different things. That's not what the whole contrastive thing is doing here.
That's not what I
So
said. I didn't say it can only ground one thing. I'm saying that the ground, for the ground to actually work as a ground, it has to basically be specific in what it grounds.
yeah, so
And if there's a
that's the same
different,
thing that
like
I
if
said.
there's a difference,
Here, guys.
but then I don't know why you're disputing the difference. Here's the thing. He accepts contrastive grounding. We both see that. Okay. So if can you demonstrate how this contrastive grounding attacks or disproves the contrastive dependence? A
Well,
depends on B, B
hang
depends
on.
on C, so A depends on C.
I just see this as
Well,
very like clear though.
I
But
don't think it refutes contrastive dependence. It does refute the transitive dependence simpliciter, right? Because that's going to be false on his view and mine. So, and you were looking for an argument against that, and this is that, right? The fact that a restricted relation, right, where we hold fixed certain contrastive facts, that there you can recover a sort of transitivity, doesn't show that dependence or grounding itself more generally is transitive. In fact, it still isn't, right? That's the whole point. So I really, actually, I have to go in literally 2 minutes. So
it's
I,
okay.
I
Yeah,
Maybe
but
we could
how
use
does
use another
my
time.
formulation, how is my formulation violated though? How is the dependence transitivity violated in my formulation? Because I've just said A, B, C. I haven't
Yeah,
said a whole group of things called A that are
with
actually
possible
different,
worlds.
right?
yeah. No.
Yeah, I haven't done
Straightforwardly.
any of that. I'm talking about just three things. That's it.
Yeah, because in that case, right, just take Schaffer's approach, right? He's going to ask you, well, what are the contrast classes here? If they're fixed in such a way which satisfy his differential transitivity principle, then yeah, they're going to be transitive. That grounding relation will be transitive. But if they're not, then it won't be. And just saying that A depends on B and B depends on C underspecifies the case. He's not going to be able to tell
It is
you
the case
whether.
Khalil's talking about, though. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's why I'm saying that the case is underspecified whether we can determine that it's transitive. In fact, and because of that, in general, that relation is not transitive, which is just his point.
Yeah. I'm saying
But
in
I
that
mean,
case scenario,
you can really have the last word.
my bad to cut
I'm
you off.
done. I
My
have
bad
to
to cut
go.
you off.
Sorry.
I'm just
Sorry.
saying
Sorry.
in that case scenario, like Khalil was specifying. Pretty sure, from my understanding, what Khalil said. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. He's saying the case scenario I'm using, this approach is transitive dependency, right? And we've provided it like countless. Maybe you weren't here. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Maybe you weren't here. You came in a little later. But like generally speaking, right? When we were talking about this, we were talking about a clear example. And I don't know if you're friends with Darth Arrhenius, but we were talking about this for at least like 30, 40 minutes, this specific example, right? So it's really the example Khalil's talking about. You know what I mean? So just had to note that.
Like, how did he
Well,
underspecify when
no,
he specifically said what he was talking about?
you can be specific in what you're talking about. The problem is that to give an answer to your question requires more specification of the case, right? And it's not going to be enough to say, oh, but there's only 3 objects we're considering here, or maybe there's only 3 objects that exist, leaving aside the kind of mereological issues.
Yeah,
You know,
but that's completely different. But anyway, yeah, go on.
because the reason that the question is still underspecifies the case is because we don't know what contrast class you're assuming, right? So because if they're the same sort of contrast class that satisfies his differential transitivity principle, then I can tell you, according to this view, that the transitive conclusion follows. But if they're not, then it won't. And not knowing what the contrast classes are, I can't tell you a priori whether it's going to follow transitively.
But here's why
That's the
you
only point
can,
there.
and there are two reasons. Number one, this is a very specific example I've given. For me, A is not a class of things, B is not a class of things, and C is not a class of things. I haven't defined it that broadly,
I
so
never
I've
talked
been
about
very
class of
specific. But
things.
number two, the grounding relation is expressed as A grounds B, B grounds C. Okay, the grounding relation. What I specified in the original example is not even that strong. It's not even that strong. It's simply A depends on B and B depends on C. So even if
Right.
we took everything you said and accepted your view about what Schaeffer says, oh, it's been underspecified, but Schaeffer is requiring the grounding relation to be specified in this way. But I didn't even give a grounding relation. I only gave a dependency relation.
Here,
Yeah.
I think we
And I
can end on
failed
that.
to see
Well, there's
how transitivity, requiring transitivity, can undermine the dependency transitivity.
yeah. I'm honestly just gonna make these 2 points, and then I'm really just gonna have to go. But I may have to continue this some other time.
Okay, yes.
So the first thing is that
Oh,
first
sorry,
the
I thought you said
brief
you were
thing,
gonna go. Just because, you know.
the brief. Yeah, I said I was going to make these 2 brief points, and then I'm going
Yeah, my apologies.
to. So the first thing, just very quick thing, I didn't say anything about classes. I'm not saying that the cases is underspecified in what things you think are satisfying the grounding relations. It's just that when you specify or ask whether A grounds B and B grounds C, whether A grounds C, that question requires you specify what you're taking the contrast class to be. And that is more information than what things there are in the world. That's a bit of a complicated issue. And if you don't understand it, that's fine. I could explain it more some other time. The second thing I want to say was either grounding is a sort of dependence relation or it isn't. If it is, then I think my argument's already done, which is just to say that because there are different sorts of dependence relations,